We'll call the meeting to order. It's 12:02 p.m. If we want to go around and introduce ourselves. I'm Michelle Lefebvre, Chair of the Exemptions Committee.
Dawn Hager-Nordblom, Maui Exemptions Committee.
Rachel Sprague, I'm calling from Lenape on the EAC and maybe the Exemptions Committee.
In per pound, per dollar, whatever.
Tom Eisen with the Environmental Review Program. And there's some other staff kind of operating the control board from up above.
Meeting's called to order, 12:03 p.m. Sorry, I was just on a 4-hour conference call. It was epic. Epic.
Hopefully productive.
That's
What's
long.
that? Yeah, and leading it. So, you know, just in the hot seat the whole time.
Do you still have brain cells in your eyes?
I do.
You know, sometimes you're like, who's that?
So send an email to Galen and Brenda and others. Let's give them a couple of minutes to join. Open the agenda.
Did they redline it, or is this a different?
Oh, it's complicated. We asked for a red line strikeout or track changes version.
Yeah.
They sent 2 versions that were not exact. They didn't have all the changes between the last version and the current one. The track changes version they had did not necessarily reflect the final list. So it wasn't the best one to review. It was helpful when you compared it. If you had it next to their revised list and the track changes, it was helpful. But if you just looked at the track changes, it didn't show everything. So I have Onana provided her comments to me on the track changes version. So then I just had to kind of compare it to the revised actual list. And I have all her comments that are applicable for when we discuss with DOE. So just to work through the agenda, the other list that's on hold is the Department of Homelands. That's back from January. I'll probably drop it after this meeting. We haven't heard anything since then. We suggested a pretty major overhaul to their list, and just ask them to think about the way that they had organized the list, which was really more for the homeowner rather than for the agency, just for a little bit of context. And so they said, oh, we're going to think about it. And so took the list back, and we haven't heard from them since. So yeah, the other list we have before the committee now is the DOE list, and they provided us a list back a few months ago. We had some comments for them March. They submitted a revised list in March. We had some comments. They were busy, but finally we got a revised list from them based on the first conversation we had. We received that in late September, but they haven't been able to make a couple of meetings. So hoping they will make this meeting. The list was pretty substantially revised, even from the version we received in March, beyond what the committee had suggested. And I think a lot of them are good changes. We just needed some extra time to drill down because it's a 23-page list. But we do have specific comments. So if they join, we'll give them a couple more minutes. And if not, we can walk through them. Dawn, did you go through the list?
I'm looking at it now. Only thing I had a comment on is over the weekend, somewhat related, is I saw one of the schools had I don't know what it's called, like a country. So it was King Keokolike High School, which is upcountry, and it's a high school, and it said the King Keokolike High School Foundation. And so there's commercial event is being used on the school grounds, and it's not the school holding it, it's the friends of the high school. So I'm just wondering if something like that is covered under the exemption list, and should it be covered? Because it's kind of like a use on the DOE campus, and it's like a nonprofit or like a friends of type thing. And I'm thinking that if we're gonna have DOE do this list, that they should be covering those types of things as well for liability.
They, well,
I'm
commercial,
not sure about anything. Yeah.
commercial activities are listed, allow accessory commercial activities within the development area that are related to.
Is a
things.
commercial activity like that friends of thing, you think? Or like commercial is selling? I don't know.
Yeah,
I was
that's
just wondering.
But I wouldn't. So
Anyway.
what concerns what's the effect that we would be concerned?
I think it's just from a departmental standpoint, if, you know, these types of things are really common with high schools in general, or schools in general, right? And so since it's a DOE property and, you know, they're getting an exemption list, I'm just saying that I think that sometimes if they're doing this commercial property that's different from what a school is normally, because a school is normally you go 8 to 5 and, you know, it's Monday through Friday and, you know, it's kind of strict, but you know, having a friends of nonprofit type of activity, I think falls outside of a school program. So I'm just trying to make sure that if they need it, it's in this exemption list that we include it. If they don't need it and it's completely outside something I'm think that should happen, then I'm okay with that too. But I just thought I'd raise it because, you know, since it's before us, it's good to, you know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah,
attack
I
it
think
now.
if I were to channel Tom, even though he's sitting right here, channel himself, he would say we aren't in the 343 arena with that sort of action.
Point taken.
Is
Yeah.
that what you would say?
I would ask that question if it is, or if it begs that point. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't see. I don't see a 340. I don't see how you're in. Again, Tom's words, 343 Funhouse with another use of, you know what I mean? I mean, schools got to comply with what, you know, whatever rules and whatever insurance and whatever, you know,
Yeah.
to comply with. And in terms of 343, I don't see how that type of thing would need to be on an exemption list because it wouldn't constitute.
Yeah. I think at the end of the day,
I would ask the question.
Yeah. I think at the end of the day, it's just good to ask the question because it's the first time I had seen this type of thing at the high school, a friends of type thing. And I'm just thinking, you know, I mean, we all pay taxes. So in my point of view, I just like to make sure that, you know, if we have these types of things before us, even for DHHL or other agencies, and a lot of, I guess you could say, activities are going the way of nonprofits now, you know, as a way to channel money or channel activities. So it's just a question, but it doesn't mean that I want to be the sticky wheel either. You know, I'm fine with their exemption list.
I think we would have to find that connection to make that point. If we wanted them to add it to their list, I think we'd have to find a reason that we thought that having hosting an activity on DOE property, you know, triggered 343. I don't see it, but
yeah, I'll just add that like on Lenae, there's, you know, like the county or HT Harvey was holding like a public meeting in one of the rooms. There's often some of it's during the day, some of it's at night. Some of those are, so they're like totally external organizations that are using the cafeteria. Some might be commercial activities, which doesn't necessarily have to be selling something in my experience. It's just, but yeah, I guess like I also in my how I have run it into 343, I don't, that I guess, yeah, it seems like that kind of falls under people in buildings or people on property. It's just different people, but it's more of just their rules and regulations and permits rather than an
and it's not for us. it's not for us to delve into their, whatever they allow on their properties. But I think at the end of the day, you know, it's such a golden opportunity to have them with their exemption list, right? So, you know, it's like making sure that they don't have to come back to us, you know, at least for a couple of years would be good. And it's just one
I
of
think
those
if
things.
there's no, yeah, but I think if there's no trigger and we can't see a trigger, then we can't really argue that they
Right.
to the list. So, but I appreciate you thinking about it, and I appreciate.
Yeah, I was just like,
I think you would need to see if there was a connection to one of the general types of actions eligible for exemption. I mean,
yeah,
since exemption lists are organized around that, would it be one of those? And there is like routine operations. I don't know
yeah,
if this is actually a routine operation or not, but it begs the point of whether it is in fact an action, because an action has to have a potential to impact the environment.
right.
If there's no potential for that, then since that's included in the definition of action, that's what excludes it from the funhouse at 343 is that
Yeah,
if
and
you
it's
can't
already,
define it as an action, then
yeah,
it's not even something to
It
talk
does,
about.
and it does specifically say, under, gosh, so this is like a part type 1 on page 5. It talks about like, leases, whatever, leases of state land involving negligible or no expansion or change of use beyond that previously existing, and permits, licenses, and rights of entry issued by the department that are routine in nature, involving negligible impacts beyond those that previously exist. To me, that kind of looks like, oh, and the, conducting operations involving the provision of goods, wares, merchandise, or services to the general public, including like, so to me, that looks like
yeah, I agree.
those
They
would
were
potentially cover
there. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
the kinds of like other people in addition to the department who have permission to be there.
So you're right, it is covered. They
Yeah,
have thought about it. Yeah, right.
And that sounds like there was a lawyer involved even with language like that. So there's some more than casual thought about it.
right. Right.
well, always good to ask. Hey, so are we supposed to wait for DOE? And if they don't show up, like
We can do
what's-
two things. I can
do you want to do the minutes?
we can talk about all our comments that I have. Now, when I type up the notes, I can provide those notes, detailed notes to them. Just then it's not a conversation. Then it's just me telling them,
Yeah,
all of our thoughts together, or we don't talk about it today and see if they can join it in January. Hoping to hear back. I haven't heard back yet.
maybe they're stuck in ledge again.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I would prefer the latter. I'd prefer a discussion so that they can give, we can, rather than us just because it's going to be a series of questions that then they have to answer in an email. But I mean, if it's very difficult for them to make the call, maybe it is better for us to do that than keep pushing out another month.
It's your call. I
Yeah.
mean, I feel like personally, if I'm here and Rachel's here and you're here, and then they should be here too. But that's my
fine. And they've done that before. I've done that before. We just send them a list of questions and they populate their answers in an email rather than we get to do it in real time. All right, well let's jump in then. We're in the fun house. Let's
Can we find a different name for Funhouse?
that's Tom's word.
Yeah, you can change it as need be.
I think it's perfect. It's where I spend most of my day. So might as well be the fun house. Okay, so one thing that we brought up last time that I was gonna ask about, or Nana had flagged in her comments as well, is the addition of the part 3. Rachel, this I guess is something we talked about last month that is relatively new. There's not a part 3 in the rules, so there's nothing that guides this edition, but Tom, what was the last agency that added? It was before I think I was on the committee, but there was an agency.
DOT did it. DOT did it. And apparently now the Department of Defense is thinking of doing it in some advanced conversations they've had with me. They liked that idea.
So the language that they quote in their part 3, it is the regulatory language that allows for emergency, for an exemption for an emergency action, but defines those emergency actions as one as declared by the governor. So it's not just, oh, there's an emergency, a pipe burst, but a governor declared emergency. So that's baked in to the rules. And Onauna's feelings were then, if it's baked into the rules, why do we need to restate it in a list? Why create a new part to a list that restates what's already in the rules? So I guess we were just going to ask the question. It's not that it can't be there, just, we're aware of a possible trend, starting with adding this new part to rules. So just wanted to talk to them about that. They had a couple of other points in their list where they identified other kinds of emergencies, but they don't break out part 3 anywhere else in their list, but they do have other kinds of emergencies identified that could be declared by the superintendent. That was under general type on page 6. Part 1, type 1 TT. Upon determination of the superintendent that an emergency exists, emergency mitigation and restoration work. So I think that appears one other time in the list. So they have identified other kinds of emergencies under different types, but they didn't break out a whole sort of part 3 part and identify them. So it was just sort of a general question about their thinking for that. And, they don't have to take it out, but don't really see why it needs to be in. Any other thoughts?
Can I ask a question about that? I've been dealing with lawyers a lot about like a conservation agreement, but it's relevant is the part 3 that they're talking about, would it like exactly restate what is in the regulation, like lift and exactly, or are they like restating in a slightly different words? The lawyers hate it when I'm going to be at the ESRC meeting on Friday because we're working on a safe harbor agreement with the state. And one of the things that we ran into was that like there are defined terms and there's terms and statements that are in the state and federal regulations. And there were parts, and then there's definitions at the beginning of this agreement. And then there were later in the agreement, like a slight restating of what a baseline is, but not using the exact same language. And then, at some point someone pulled out, there are like 4 different, slightly different versions of what the conservation baseline is. And they're like, that's going to make somebody crazy at some point, and it would be better to have your definition once or reference the statute, and then from there on out, you're just using a capitalized emergency that's referencing that part of the, I don't know if it's in the HRS or what, yeah, or like if it is in 343, that would avoid potentially some point where they're going back and forth between the emergency section in the statute and the emergency language in the exemption list if they're slightly different, like which one wins.
So the way they've written it, part 3, number 1 in DOE's list, when an agency proposes is straight from this, the rule that they're citing from HAR section 11-200.1-8B. So that's that's straight from. 2 is the same. It's the same. It's part B. It's just the next sentence. If the emergency action has not substantially commenced within, the action will be subject to. And then C, in the event, that one also appears to be word for word. Yeah, it's word for word.
And I guess that's less of a.
It's less of a thing, and I think that's why Onana probably didn't have that extreme reaction. That if they had restated, I think she would have been like, no, don't restate it. But she was like, well, I'm not really sure why you would create a new part 3 that already says what the rules say.
Certainly, they do not have the power to supersede what the rules state. An exemption list is just a guidance document. I mean, I guess it doesn't hurt if something is reiterated there, but it begs the point why. But yeah, what's the harm also, I suppose, is the balancing thought.
So that's, just ask the question. Yeah, you can't. Okay. One of the comments on the first list was to add reference to the dark sky protections. And they didn't cite the statute, but they did add outdoor lighting to be dark sky compliant whenever they talked about exterior lights. So that seemed, I think they're acknowledging.
What page are you on? Sorry.
It's multiple times. The first time
Oh,
on page 5.
That's okay. I'll just do a word search. Yeah. Okay.
Just search for dark sky compliant.
Okay.
So impacts to seabirds. So that was a request on the first list, and they did add it. It's interesting if you look at the track changes version, though, they did have the statute included. So I guess in a revision, but in one of their track changes versions, they do say in compliance with HRS 201-8.5 night sky protection. But I think it captures the intent by saying compliant with dark skies. I think for me, the next big one was on page 9 for exemption type 3. It was interesting to compare exemption type 3 under part 1, which is page 9, to the same exemption type for part 2. If you look at page 19, at the beginning of 19 and 20. So the type is construction and location of single new small facilities, right? And the rules list A through D on page 9. So single family, so the exemption applies, right, to single family residences less than 3,500 square feet, etc. So that's what the rules say. And then they list all these facilities underneath it on pages 9, 10, 11, and the beginning of 12. But if you jump to page 19, they say that the same exemption type would apply to larger structures. So even though it's baked in the rules, the size should not exceed, should not be more than 3,500 square feet. They're trying to apply the part 2 exemption to a larger, the way I read it, a larger structure than is allowed by the rules. Tom, is that how you?
Sorry.
Okay. So part,
that's
okay. So type 3 exemption, part 1 versus part 2. Part 1 on page 9 talks about single family residences, everything that's listed in the rules, under 30 or less than 3,500 square feet, not in conjunction with, all those rules. And the way it seems the DOE is interpreting it is that applies to part 1. And then for part 2, for the same exemption type, they've increased the square footage, they've increased the density. So to me, it's a stretch of the rules. They're going outside the rules.
Yeah,
I
I
just-
would
Take a look at page
And
19 and 20.
to agree that the rules only allow an exemption up to, for a single family residence, less than 3,500 square feet. If it was more than that, then it wouldn't qualify as a type of action eligible for exemption. Couldn't be a part two.
Exactly. So that's where it seemed funny to me. So part one, for part one, type 3, they list the rule and they type, they write all these types of activities that they would do that fall under it. But then on page 19 and 20, they just take the first line of the type 3 exemption and then make up, then develop new criteria for a part 2.
Yeah,
Just,
I would say they don't have the right to do that.
that's what I
If it's
thought.
bigger than 3,500 square feet, it couldn't be exempted.
Right.
Period.
And it goes on with the other things, right? So
Right.
it's a less than, if not in conjunction with, and the way it's written on page 19, okay, it says if not in conjunction with. Then for B on page 20, for more than 4 dwelling units and in conjunction with the building of 2 or more structures. So then for that one to apply, you have to build at least 2 5-unit or larger structures. Like it's just, anyway, it seems outside the rules. And
Yeah, I would say certainly without some deep thinking that would require an EA. It couldn't be exempted, something that
couldn't
there's
be exempted
part
based on the
two,
definition.
right? So whether it begs a question, should something that complies be a type 1 or a type 2, but only something that complies with the rules can be considered for exemption? And I would tend to say probably a type 2 because it's not de minimis to build something of that nature.
Right. Okay, that one jumped out at me. I noticed on page 10 under 15B, they had teacher workforce housing units, and that's kind of what I was like, well, we have it here, then we have it under 3, part 1 and part 2, and then I realized, whoa, they're doing some
Creative.
So what do you want to do, Michelle, about page 19 then? Do you want to strike it out or tell them it's not possible or doesn't fit with the current or whatever
some
county
bigger
rules?
stuff. Right.
Yeah.
I'll say A through D don't fit with the current rules. So all those things, are not allowed, by the rules. But, the other things in the list on page 20, I think fit fine as a part 2 type 3 exemption. Just those first 4 you can't sort of create out of the rules categories. So I would suggest that, and I would suggest
I mean, are they trying to build a townhome versus like a single family? Because a lot of, I know schools are trying to build more density for footprint. So I could see them trying to do this, right?
Yeah.
Or try is the operative word. I don't actually care if it's an existing school campus and they're adding footprint to it, but I think if it's
which is why all those things would be exempt if you're building things, under that size limit. And that would be fine. It's just we don't want to go outside the rules and suggest they can do more than the rules allow.
Right.
Yeah. So I would also recommend striking 15.
Well, oh, I'm sorry. Also, I mean, I know we're not talking county rules or state rules, but, I don't want an agency to go in and say, well, we got this exemption, and then they're fighting with the county and saying, well, we got this, so, you got to work with us, right? I think it should be compliant all the way around in general.
I think it was just a confusion that probably they probably cut, A through D and put it in part 1. And then they're like, oh, thought that was the modifiable part, the changeable part, and then put it in part 2 and like, oh, part 1 will be, this size and smaller, and part 2 will be this size and bigger. But I think when they made that cut and paste, they probably just didn't realize it was part of the rules and that part couldn't be modified. But I'm hope that's what was done. Um, on page 11, so this is part 1, type 2, which type 3, construction. Number V, which is fuel tanks and above and underground. I just thought that should be part 2. I think just given the sensitivity of fuel tanks, might as well have a notice for that. Any other thoughts on that? And then on 11 and 1209, I had flagged FF, GG, and HH as part 2. So rehabbing multi-residential units, rehabbing buildings and improvement, and temporary staging areas could be part 2 instead of part 1. Page 13, number 15, there's just a typo in ordinance. There's no I. Had to learn that one the hard way. Page 14, there's a box around exemption type 6, and there were no other boxes, so just thought, delete that. Now I had flagged this exemption type, saying that depending on the scope of the demolition, it might be more applicable to or more appropriate to include under part 2, requiring a notice. So, depending on the size. So if you were just demolishing one building, that might be, type 1 or part 1. But if you were, demolishing an entire school, that might fall more under part 2. So just getting them to think about maybe size of demolition and what might be more appropriate under part 1 versus part 2 for that type 6.
So I see Galen has just signed in.
Oh, great. Hi, Galen.
She's muted.
Oh, hello. Hi. Sorry
Hi.
about that. Oh, we had a budget deadline and I just not been able to get back to all my emails. So sorry about that.
No worries. We were just marching through your list, but we can backtrack a little bit.
Okay.
And review what we were just chatting about.
Let's
Great.
remember about the time, because we have a 1 o'clock meeting
We
also.
do have a 1 o'clock, 12:35. So we'll march through a little bit quickly. But first thing was the addition of part 3 to the exemption list. We realize it's quoting the rules back, -8B and 8C, but it's new. It's not a requirement to have part 3 to the exemption list. I guess just if you had any provide any rationale or explanation for what you guys were thinking to add
Okay, let me
that part.
zoom down. Do we have a part 3?
Yeah, on page 2.
Oh. 1. Oh, okay. I think this was added because and with the wildfires and things, there sometimes is emergency actions that are necessary, whether it's that or the lava flows that occurred where we don't always, we aren't always able to follow, the part 1 or part 2 directions. And so I think it's just saying if it's an emergency action, that this is the only time that these actions would come up.
Right, as allowed, by the rules, right? As your list quotes it. Just it's. I guess we were just talking about doesn't do any harm to list it there. There are no part 3 is identified throughout. There's nothing in the rules that sort of identifies a part 3 to the list. So, guess didn't have to add it, but it's fine that you did.
Okay.
Just keeping in mind there's not like specific exemption types under part 3, because there is no part 3 according to the rules, I guess.
Okay, I understand.
Yeah.
So you're saying whether it's in there or not, that could
It
still
applies.
be something that's applicable. Okay,
Exactly.
got it.
It applies
Okay.
regardless. And we
Okay,
did see
I'll
there
mention
were
that to Jadine because
yeah. So just we noticed the DOT had done it in their list, and so maybe that was like a little bit of a trend
that was
starting, and it's not wrong, but it applies regardless, like you said. Okay. We did notice that you added the outdoor lighting, dark sky compliance, so that was good. I noticed the teacher workforce housing units in exemption part 1, type 3. And it got me thinking about your part 1 versus part 2, looking at the exemption, types under part 1 and part 2. And under part 1, type 3, A through D lists straight from the rules the types of exemptions that fall under the construction and location of single small facilities. But under part 2, those have been modified. So on page 20, A through D exceed the amount allowed by the rules. So page 9 is correct. A through D on page 9 are correct and match the rules, but A through D on page 20 exceed the size allowance from the rules. Does that make sense? So the rules say that, like for A, single family residences should be less than 3,500 square feet. But on page 20, under part 2, your list is more than 3,500 square feet. So I guess it's just taking a look at A through D on page 20. What's outside of that exemption type, right? I guess actually D reads the same. To serve such structures or facilities, accessory equipment. Actually, D reads the same. The issue is just A through C. Galen, are you still there?
She's muted, I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's no camera and no microphone for Galen.
Yeah.
She should be able to hear her.
sorry. Okay. I've been talking and I didn't realize I was still.
Oh no!
muted.
Oh no!
Okay, no, yeah, I see that, but I was also comparing it to what we had submitted before and yeah, noticing the change in the language. So let me double check that. I guess I think they were looking at it as modifying those numbers, but I guess
Right.
if we look at the rules, yeah, they're
Exactly.
already identifying those examples. Okay, got it.
Exactly. That was it. I figured somebody just was like, oh, that's the editing. That's the part you can edit. And then part 1 will be less than, and part 2 will be more than. But yeah, exactly. Since those are tied to the rules, you can't do more than under part 2.
Okay, got it.
Okay. Yep. Yeah, because on page 10, you said, 15B, teacher workforce housing units.
Oh,
But-
sorry, I missed that because moped zoom by. Sorry, what was that?
That's okay. That's okay. On page 10, 15B is the teacher workforce housing units. So, I mean, I think it's still worth thinking about, considering what falls under this category, what then should be considered part one or what should be considered part two. So if it was a very small teacher workforce housing unit, maybe something under 3,500 feet, a very small thing, then maybe that would be a part one. But if it was a larger structure, and you guys can think about what that means, maybe the larger structures would fit still within, the exemption, the rule limit, but maybe that would be part two. So I guess just to think about what would, of those, types of facilities, what would fall under part one and what would fall under part two.
Okay.
On page 11, V, I just thought maybe fuel tanks could be considered for part two, just with the sensitivity of constructing fuel tanks above and underground. I know it's got to go through all the, required permitting, but I think still to consider for part two. And Onana, who is no longer on the committee and was planning to attend but couldn't attend today, also recommended at the bottom of 11 and 12 to consider FF and GG and HH to be part two also instead of part one, just because of the larger structures and more work, and would be worth notifying the public for those three.
Okay, and this would be like just new, or even if we were doing renovations too?
This is all under construction, but those specifically say rehab, FF and GG both say rehab. HH is new, it's temporary staging. So, I mean, just to consider, whether the benefits the neighbors and the public to know if major, rehab would be happening. On page 13, at the top, number 15, ordinance, just a typo, it doesn't have an I. Ordinance. On page 14, there's a box around type 6, but the other types didn't have boxes. I just thought for consistency.
Let me zip down.
Right there.
I'm sorry, what was the last one? Page 14?
14. Yeah, there's just a box around type 6, but there weren't boxes.
Okay.
You can add boxes to the others or take that box out.
Okay.
Look the same. And then for that one, for type 6, considering, this demolition and removal of structures, again, maybe that size threshold for part one or part two, like if you're just demolishing one building or a certain size building, that's smaller, that could be the part one, or if you're, tearing down a whole school, that would be, part two. So I'm thinking about that size threshold for these facilities for part one versus part two.
Okay.
Onana's suggestion on page 15 was that 3 and 4, the zoning variances, be moved, those two specific for housing developments and for buildings and structures, moved to part two to consider that. So number 3 and 4. And then on 16, page 16.
Okay, so but for some of those, like for heights and things, it's kind of typical for schools.
Mhm.
So I guess we're saying if a building otherwise falls, but within reason, but they need a height variance because a lot of our schools are built in residential districts, which have a minimum height. So when we start building multiple stories, it kind of triggers that. Also for starting work or having work go beyond the normal day to at least but not into like late night kind of things. We've asked for some kind of variances. So you're saying, is it certain types of variances, or are you just saying any variance? Because I feel like
Yeah,
most of our projects have variances.
right, right. We wouldn't want to make that any harder than it needs to be.
Yes.
Getting the zoning variance itself. So yeah, I mean, she's not here to explain. I don't know. Tom, do you have any feelings on why any?
Well, one thing just to keep in the back of mind is that whenever you'd be applying for a variance, that would presumably be to like a county planning agency, and they may immediately just look to say, where has chapter 343 been addressed? And
Mhm.
she's done a type 1 exemption. There's no documentation that exists to show that chapter 343 has been addressed. If there's a type 2, then there'd be an exemption notice, which you could then kind of wave around and say, we've gone through the process for this. But with only a type 1, there's no documentation to show
Okay,
that.
I see.
So that it could be helpful in those cases, especially when you know you're going before a county agency that does have some jurisdiction over the project.
Okay.
So yeah, I guess maybe thinking about in that context, if any of those, variances would fit under that, that would help
Okay.
to put it under too. It's really, yeah, it should be something that helps you, not hinders you there. Okay. On page 16, number 15 and 18 under type 8, both do with acquisition of land. So wondered if they fit better under type 9, since that type is for the acquisition of land.
Okay.
Okay. On page 17, I think Onana had a question, on number, at the bottom of 17, number 3, to allow accessory commercial activities within the areas, within the development that are related to 2. And 2 is the offsite infrastructure. So I guess accessory, she just was questioning what would be accessory commercial activities to offsite infrastructure associated with affordable housing. Sorry, I'm trying to follow her logic there.
Okay. This is for affordable. Okay, let's see. Okay, construction requisite offsite infrastructure. And allow commercial activities within the development that are related to number 2 above. Okay, so I'm thinking that they're looking at like P3 type of construction, and because there's with that there sometimes is some leeway with commercial activities, that we wanted to put something in there to show that it might not just be housing and the schools, that there might be some other component, and the commercial could be more like um, a third party coming in for social services or other kinds of components that will be running, or a clinic that might be running on in the facility, but not necessarily like opening up a whole shopping district kind of thing. So yeah,
That
I
makes
think
sense. That makes sense. Okay. All right. Okay. Page 18. We're moving to part 2 of the list. It seemed a few things listed under type 1 would would easily be, could be part one, repairs, maintenance of bike racks and fencing and stairs. So some of it is listed in part one. I see, bike racks is in part one, type one. Just so, folks don't feel like they have to do a exemption notice to repair a bike rack in part two. Might just be worth going through that list under type one and seeing what's already listed under part one that, is really the de minimis stuff and deleting it from the part two section.
Okay. So yours just saying bike racks or other?
Bike racks is the one that jumped out at me, but signage, stairs, signage, those are all listed in type one, part one. So no need to do it twice, and certainly I don't think any need to do it under part two. So I guess just to go through the part two type ones and eliminate the ones you've already identified in part one.
Okay, got it.
I see bike racks, and fencing, and stairs.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Almost done, or almost out of time. On page 19, number 2, acquisition of land utilizes maintenance. Again, just thought that would fit under the type 9. Just it had to do with acquisition of land.
This is page 19.
19, number 2.
Number 2, okay.
At the top, acquisition of land. Presently, maybe that fit better under type 9, which is acquisition of land.
Okay.
And and I'm going to point it out on page 22, at the top of 22, number 11, major alteration, where the exemption type is minor alterations in the condition of land or water. And then 11 says major alteration.
Okay.
Just pointing out there might jump out. Maybe there's just another way to qualify. It's defenses and
yeah, okay.
it's rotating walls and fences, maybe just a different word than major.
Okay.
That
maybe if
that
we
is
just
it.
say modifications.
There we go. I think that
of retaining. Okay.
Yep. And that is it.
Okay.
For us.
Yeah, sorry for that major change, but I guess we were trying to look at something that was smaller and didn't have all the items, because one of the issues we had before was if something isn't listed and we go in this route of itemizing things, then we might have to look at modifications later where if we identified it, how we started off where we were just making clear or what we initially thought might be cleaner distinctions. But I think our admin having seen some of the other lists that were approved, kind of wanted to identify things again. So we went from a much shorter list to this much bigger 23-page list. So sorry about that.
No,
big change.
no, I think and if it's a list that helps, helps the agency work better, because it helps, it's done the thinking already, so that folks after don't have to go through this exercise again and what falls under part 1 and part 2, and just because something's not listed doesn't mean it doesn't fall under that category. So the list is not, as long as it falls within that category type, you don't have to modify it to add 1 or 2 things later. You can still can still fall under a category. You can still publish, exemption notices for part 2, even if it's not a specific activity listed there. I think you guys have done a lot of really good work, to do this thinking, to help the agency move forward. So I think it's great. I think it's really good.
Okay.
So yeah, if you guys want to make these revisions or consider the few points that we said and then send us a revised list, then we can do it, add you to the January agenda, and then we can move it out to Big Council to approve, and then we can publish it for public review for 15 days.
Okay. And when does it have to get in for that January review, or when?
Well,
what would be the best
we would
time
have
to-
our meeting probably, Rachel, what do you think? We have the holidays.
Yeah, we need to chat about dates for that, because
Right.
I'm not available in early May, or in early January, but I don't know what quorum is these days. So
That's true. We could have an exemption committee meeting. So it would be
yeah, for sure.
6 days before the meeting. We would need the list by, so by the end of December, Galen,
Okay.
to be safe. And then once we set the meeting, whether it's the first Tuesday of the 7th or whether it's the 14th, but if we have it by the end of December, that will give us enough time. I know nobody has anything else to do at the end of the year, so
Okay. Should I change a date to 2025 then?
Oh yes, that's a good idea. Yeah, because it'll
Okay.
publish
On the
it'll go
draft. Yeah.
in 2025. Thank you.
Okay. Great.
Okay. Great.
Anna,
Well, look forward
thanks.
to seeing that
Thanks
list
for
in.
reaching out and grabbing me. I
No
really
worries.
appreciate
I'm glad
it.
you could make it. I'm glad you could make it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Oh,
Okay.
approval of the meeting minutes. Well, the exemption guidance document we don't have time to talk about today, so we'll defer that to the next meeting. And then the review and approve November 14th meeting minutes. Dawn, did you get a chance to look at them? Is that a yes? Give me a thumbs up. Okay.
You're muted, Dawn.
I'm sorry, I muted.
Yep.
Okay. I was just gonna say, do I move to approve the minutes? Or do
Yes,
you move to
you.
approve the minutes?
Oh, you can move.
Rachel.
You can move to approve. I second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Great. Okay, motion approves. Great. Well, we can adjourn the meeting at 1 o'clock and jump to our other one. Thank you.
Do we just stay on? Or
No,
is
it's a
there?
different link.
It's a different link. I was going to ask that too. Okay.